Today we're going to be covering information. And before we do, I want to go over a couple quick announcements. So I graded the homework grades. A lot of you did really well on it. There was some room for improvement, though, with some of the responses I got, particularly on question 2. So question 2 asks you to go through different types of information that organizations use, describe what they are, and describe how they're used. Some people could have had a better response there. So I gave some feedback on, the particulars regarding that. If you didn't get the grade you hoping was 100, didn't get that, next time when you submit your homework, make sure that you look back and kind of have a better idea of what I'm looking for on that sort of thing. If you do get 100 on the next assignment, I'll go ahead and replace the assignment with homework 1. It's my goal that you are able to understand material, you're able to describe how organizations use the material. It's not so much my goal that you have 100 on every assignment, but I certainly would like that. That'd be a great thing. So that's kind of how I graded it. Like I said, a lot of people did really well on it, but there is some room for are there any questions about that? Another thing I want to point out is that don't copy and paste from the book for any of the responses. It's certainly fine to paraphrase stuff in the book, but make sure you put stuff in your own words. Some people copied and pasted. It didn't count off this week, but certainly moving forward, it's not really what I'd look for in a homework response. So just want to make sure that everyone's kind of on the same page with that. Any questions regarding homework? Certainly, if you have any questions about your specific grade, feel free to stop me after class. I'm happy to go over that with you. You can also send me an email or attend office hour, either virtually or in person. It's up to you, whichever you prefer. Like I said, I do want everyone to understand how to get a good grade, basically what I'm looking for, that sort of thing. So with that out of the way, let's go ahead and talk about information. So the whole concept with information is that we have data and we've processed it into something usable. This could be we've taken our sales, we've added them up for location. This could be we've taken the sales for a specific product and added them. This could be we have taken the cost and we have subtracted the cost from the earnings. Give us some sort of a rough idea of what we actually made. Lots of different things we can do to obtain information. The whole concept is that we want to use this effectively as an organization. So just kind of go over some of this briefly. We're in the 21st century. There's a lot of data that is being kind of transmitted. We're collecting lots of data. We're processing lots of data. And hopefully we're gaining some sort of knowledge from that. So the whole idea behind this is that we're in the information age, meaning that there's lots of information, and it's up to us to make sense of it and to form knowledge based upon that information. So different key concepts here. We have different things to consider. So for subsistence, we're focused on how do we survive. So we look for information regarding survival. This could be things like what amount of food or water does a person need to survive? What amount of oxygen? If we're looking at agriculture, we're focused on how do we best grow crops? How do we water them effectively? How do we plant them properly? What time do we plant them? All that's the information we'd be focused on. We're thinking about things in the service sector. We would look for customer service metrics. Are our customers satisfied? Do we have lots of returns on our products and services? Those are the sorts of things we would look at. So that's pretty much what we're discussing here. This is a kind of a broad overview. I'm going to skip this exercise. We're not focused so much on sustainability. We're more focused on applying information to form knowledge inside of this chapter. So here's an interesting discussion right here, though. I'm talking about wealth creation. And, I'm not saying I agree or disagree with it. There's certainly a variety of opinions here when we're talking about a topic like wealth creation. So the book defines some old wealth and some new wealth. Now, I'm not here to say this is right or wrong. What do you guys think? Is military less valuable than intelligence? And what do you say now? Okay. William, right? Certainly a great response. Does anyone feel differently? Anyone feel like intelligence is more valuable than military? What do you say? So you could say it's more about military intelligence. Okay. Certainly another way to look at it. Further right. Gotcha. Any other thoughts? What do you think? Yeah, I mean, it's less about having more soldiers, it's more about having those soldiers be more effective in whatever they're doing. Great answer, back it, right? Yeah, so there's a lot of different ways to look at it. I wouldn't discount military. Same thing with natural resources versus marketing. I don't know about you guys, I'd rather have food and water than I would have advertisements. Hopefully you all would agree there. If you disagree, that's fine though. Anyone prefer getting some good old promotions in the mail? Yeah, I don't think too many people would. So same thing with population versus global reach. This is an interesting topic. Is it more important for a nation to have a larger population, or is it more important for that nation to have, tremendous advances in things like science, technology, having advances in things like global relations, making sure that other nations like you, get along with people? Which one is more important? Who's to say? That's really more of a topic for a different course. So yeah, that's just kind of some of the things here. Lastly, industry versus education. I don't think those are mutually exclusive. You can certainly obtain an education and go work in industry. You can work in industry to further your education. So, this is just some things from the book, not necessarily, nor am I not endorsing them. So yeah, just kind of moving on, talking about the information age a little bit. The whole concept is we have lots of data, and we process the data to form information, and the whole idea is that unlike traditional goods and services, information is a lot harder to do things like stop the flow of it. So you can imagine something like a cryptocurrency. Take Bitcoin, for example. Many nations attempt to stop the flow of Bitcoin. Is that good or bad? One answer. What do you think?
I'll say,
Certainly true. Any other thoughts? So is it even possible to stop the flow of information? Okay. Give me a country that would try. Okay. Are they successful in that? True. Yeah, there's always going to be a sort of less than ideal market. I don't want to say ideal. A less than official market. Let's use that term. But certainly, it's near impossible to fully stop the flow of information because information, unlike a lot of other things, it's not necessarily a physical product. You can certainly have it internal to yourself. If I know something, I can tell you freely. No one can really stop me from doing so. Same thing if you knew something. You could whisper it to your classmate. Well, hopefully not, but you could. You could certainly text them, send them an email, whatever sort of social media you guys are using nowadays. That's certainly one way you can transmit information. For the record, I don't really care how you transmit information in class, as long as it's not distracting. So, free to ask any questions as we go along, or you can feel free to, in a non-distracting fashion, ask your classmates. So let's go ahead and move on a little bit, talk about some different information areas here. So basically, we started off about 1950s or so, had very centralized systems, and we did batch processing of things. It could be things like course registration was quite popular, credit card transactions. The whole concept is you had a large amount of in data that you wanted to make some sense of. So if you're doing credit card transactions, you have a large amount of transactions, you want to actually, make sure that you're collecting the money from it. You want to make sure that you're actually, if you're getting a return, you get the return credit, whatever the case may be. We move forward a little bit, we get to sort of the host terminal architecture, where it's still centralized, but you have a decentralized method to access in the case of a terminal. So basically, this kind of allowed us to have somewhat more autonomy in terms of doing data and information processing. Fast forward to today, of course, now we're using more of the client-server architecture. Client-server architecture, pretty much everyone has a device capable of accessing whatever system they're on, and it really provides a lot of autonomy, and kind of in a way reduces a lot of their reliance upon very hierarchical system for a lot of things regarding information distribution. So let's talk about how IS plays a role in this. So, the whole concept is that individuals comprise an organization. Those individuals contribute information, they contribute data to the organization. And through the use of an information system, we can compile all that into a singular location and allow for easy processing. So that's kind of the who. We'll talk about the what, how they actually go about this. So what they're going to do is they're going to actually sit down, they're going to put in information in some cases. In some cases, the process is more automated. You think about any sort of transaction processing system. You're probably not manually inputting transactions. If you are, you're probably doing it incorrectly because the whole point is that it's supposed to save the organization processing time. It's supposed to make things more efficient. It's supposed to reduce the reliance upon physical labor, or not necessarily physical labor, but certainly some sort of non-automated labor. And that's kind of what we're going about this. Talk about the where. Any place that the user interacts with the system. That's where the value is going to be generated. So if we have a customer relationship management software and we have a module to interact with our customers, maybe we have a chat option. So, someone is going through, they're a customer, they're chatting with us. That's where the value comes in. We're reaching out to the customer, providing them with information, we're providing them with maybe new sales, that sort of thing. Lastly, the when. This is simply when it generates value is when it's being used. So if you had something, let's say, for example, you had access to a class and you never actually showed up to class, would you get any value from that class? The only time you get value from that class is if it were a mandatory class and the instructor just gave you an A. And that's really not very beneficial in terms of learning more information, but it could still be beneficial in passing you through. That's not going to happen in here. You have to do the work. But just as an aside, that's what that would be. If you have the opportunity to obtain some sort of value, you're going about it, you have to actually then follow through and obtain the value. There's actually a pretty substantial debate within the business community. Does IS truly generate value for the firm? So who can tell me what resource-based view are, the 4 characteristics of value? The resource-based view, for something to be valuable, has to be rare, operationalizable by the firm, has to be something that is impossible or very difficult to imitate, and lastly, has to be something that people are inherently willing to assign a value to. So there's 3 or 4 components there. And with IS, it's not impossible to imitate. It's quite simple. If someone has a system, how can they make the system to where no one can imitate it? Really, the only option you have is with intellectual property rights. What about places that don't recognize intellectual property rights? You have no protection of that good or service. You can certainly look at a case like Huawei. Huawei, of course, being a company that is accused of intellectual property theft from firms like Cisco and other United States firms. I believe Qualcomm has also accused them of some IP theft. So that's certainly a case where it's not impossible to imitate. So does it still generate value? Tough to say. There's no right or wrong answer here. Certainly, like I say, it's a very large debate. It's been ongoing since about early 2000s. Nicholas Carr, in 2003, published his famous piece, IT Doesn't Matter. I believe it was on HBR. Someone has to double check me on that. But the whole concept is that IT does not support the 4 main necessary categories to be valuable. Therefore, it cannot give you a strategic advantage. So for something to truly be a strategic advantage, it has to be something that cannot be imitated. It's rare. If you sit there and use IT for your strategic advantage, it's not going to give you that sort of value. So that's That's kind of a quick little aside there. So of course we're not just content in putting the information in the system and never having anyone access it. So we want to make sure that whatever we're doing is very easy to obtain. So this could certainly be done in a lot of different ways. We could do a physical report where people obtain some report that's relevant to what they're doing, and that would enable them to easily get information that they can then apply to whatever their job is. Lots of options here. So we think about the Mohs hardness scale. Of course, that's relating to minerals. The higher the number, the harder the mineral is. The more easily I think it can scratch something else. So, at the very basic level here, we have talc. Talc is incredibly not hard. I guess incredibly soft would be a better way to describe it than not hard. But starting to get the idea. So diamond, of course, being a 10, means that it is one of the hardest things there is. So information has a similar thing. And basically, what this is saying is that information that is from unverified sources is not very reliable. So instead of this being something in terms of how hard is the information, it's not how difficult, it's how reliable is the information. So as we move down this list, we're going to see things that are more and more reliable. So it lists stock and exchange and commodity market data as the most reliable source of information. Does anyone agree or disagree with that? Do you guys trust Enron's 2000 financial reports? You would not. I would hope not. They allegedly were some misleading information within them. So, just because something is more reliable doesn't necessarily mean that that individual piece is more reliable than something competing. It's more of an average. So if you think about a regression, you have the expected value of beta. That's going to be equal to the true value of beta. But if we think about that, is that meaning that every single experimental beta that we receive is equal to the true value of beta? No, it doesn't. It means that the average of it is going to be equal to it. So when we put this in this context, it means that this is what we'd expect to see on the whole, but it's not what we'd expect to see for any one singular piece of information. So just kind of keep that in mind. We kind of have another competing concept, not necessarily competing, but a different concept. How rich is the information? In other words, how much additional information beyond the words that are being said can we receive? So if we have face-to-face communication, we can see things like facial expression. We can hear things like intonation. We can observe things such as kind of these behaviors that people tend to exhibit. If someone's nervous, maybe they shake. If someone is excited, maybe they get a little, anxious. Whatever the case may be, that's stuff we can observe. Can we observe that in numerical documents? Maybe if they're handwritten, we can see some minor things, but on the whole, we can't. So the whole concept is that there's kind of a spectrum of information richness. As we go from more rich to less rich information, we see that sort of secondary information become less and less available to us. So if I write a document, that's going to have less information than if I give a lecture. That's certainly going to have more information there. Okay, so any questions? Again, like I say, next class we'll pick up a little bit in terms of having kind of more difficult, more challenging material. But for now, let's go ahead and talk about some different classes of information. So the first is going to be content class of information. And within this is information that really derives its value from what's inside the information. So this is describing something. Maybe this is something that has a large amount of data, that sort of thing. In this case, they use the example of the Model S advertisement. That's content. It's telling you information about that specific product. So it has things like 4.2 seconds, 0 to 60. That's certainly faster than what I'm driving right now. Anyone have a car that's faster than that? It'd be cooler if you did, but that's a different story. So yeah, you kind of see what the content is. Then we have form. Form is like a blueprint. So if we have form information, it's going to describe things at a very intricate detail. So in this case, it's using the shape and composition of an object as the example. That's not all form information could be. So if we had a financial model and something simple like y hat equals something like beta 0 plus beta 1 x1 plus beta 2 x2. That sort of model. That's also form information. It's describing some form of data. So in this case, it's saying what goes into a Tesla. What are the parts? What are the specific measurements of each part? What materials are each part comprised of? So that sort of information is what we're going to see when we're looking at form information. And we have behavior. So behavior is going to be some sort of simulation. It's going to emulate something else. So for example, if we do a Monte Carlo simulation, that's for a market. And then lastly, an action is information that actually performs some task. So in this case, it uses the example of the speed sensors and kind of having that autonomous decision making within driving. Now this could also be things like a factory line where you have information that is being used to do basic production tasks. This could be things like measuring a part to make sure it's within the quality that we kind of expect. So there's lots of different options here. Any questions? Classes of information. Okay, let's talk about how this can actually be used for organizational change. So first, let's talk about what organizational change is. So, certainly organizations have some amount of change. This could be anything from changing employment, changing who's employed in which position, rather. It could be things like changing budget allocations. It could be things like changing processes, changing our technology systems. Lots of different options for what technology is. So, with that in mind, who can list some other types of organizational change? Anyone want to? What you think?
Like Ford kind of like downsized everything right before the.
Okay. So they had some employment changes and some manufacturing, and since then they've done even more drastic changes. I believe they stopped making all but like 2 or 3 models of cars. Do they still make the Mustang? Okay. But I think they quit making a lot of their other automobiles. I'm not here to, say anything regarding the quality of their automobiles or anything like that, but certainly, that's information we would want to have if we were purchasing an automobile. So that's certainly some organizational change right there. What we want to do, though, is we have information we don't have. That is our gap information. So if we wanted to say, well, we need to reduce our cost of doing business by 15% in the next quarter, we don't know how we do that. We know what we want to do. We know what we're doing right now. So imagine our current cost of goods sold. Let's use that as an example. Current cost of goods sold is $1 billion. We were going to reduce that 15%. What is our desired performance? Should be 850 million. So that's what we want to have for cost of goods sold because we're reducing that by 15%. So we know what change we need. We don't know how to get there. That's the gap information. So we've set the goal. We kind of define it. That's what we're doing inside the anchoring process. Then we plan. How do we actually get there? How are we going to specifically reduce our cost of goods sold? Are we going to sell crappier products? Are we going to sell fewer products but sell more of them? So in other words, are we going to better utilize economies of scale and reduce the production cost of products while also, sort of reducing the overall amount of product? So let's say we're Ford Motor Company. That's a good example. Maybe we have certain lines of automobiles that are not selling well. So we would cut those and we would replace them with nothing. We would just say, buy a different model of our vehicles. And that would certainly reduce the production costs. Because as we know, the more unique a product or service is, the more costs that are going to be associated with that specific product. So then we would do benchmarking. We would sit there and we would say, how are our competitors acting? What sorts of things are they doing? So if we're Ford, we would look at Chevy. We would look at Toyota, Honda, those sorts of companies. And we would see, how do we compare to what they're doing? So benchmarking is always going to be comparing to someone else. To kind of go back to the gap information a little bit, this is where we're actually looking at that gap between what we have right now and what we want to obtain. And we want to determine, how do we actually get to where we want to go? So we look at the gap information, we certainly go through it. We do things like scorekeeping. We determine what specific measures we need to hit. So if we're talking about reducing the cost of goods sold, I listed several off. We could certainly reduce the individual cost of our products. We could also reduce the amount of products. What are some other things we could do to reduce cost of goods sold? How about disintermediation? Who wants to talk about disintermediation? What is disintermediation? So disintermediation is going to be the removal of some aspect of the supply chain. So if we think about a traditional supply chain, what do we have? Well, we have suppliers. Then we have some sort of manufacturer. We have distributor, wholesaler. We have retailer. We have the customer. And then ultimately, we have the consumer. So we obviously can't remove the customer. They're the people buying the product or service from us. We can remove a distributor, wholesaler. We can also remove a retailer. We can't remove the manufacturer in most cases. There certainly could be exceptions to that. Think about the manufacturer for a build-it-yourself airplane. Who's the manufacturer if you're building it yourself? It's the customer. That's exactly correct. So in some cases, we actually can remove the manufacturer, but that's pretty atypical. The reason that a person would build their own airplane is because they're very interested in aviation. They're probably not doing it because because it's safer. Is it safer to build your own airplane than to have a manufacturer build? Let me ask it this way. Would you fly in an airplane that someone else made, not inside of factories, inside their garage? Why not? It could be dangerous. You don't know what sort of quality measures they took. Do you trust someone who's been in a factory and has, supervisors looking over what they're doing? They have machines that are making sure everything's done properly. All these sorts of measures. What do you trust a dude in his garage? So that's kind of getting off topic a little bit there. But that's certainly what we're looking at with gap information. How can we get there? So disintermediation is another way. Who can think of another way to reduce our cost of goods sold? We've talked about lowering the product costs themselves. Probably going to sacrifice a little quality there. We've talked about cutting back on our product line some. Talked about disintermediation. Is there any other ways we could go about this? What do you think? So that'd be disintermediation. Any other things we could do? We can also engage in business process improvement and see any other sorts of processes within an individual aspect of the supply chain that we could cut back on. So we're not actually going to remove our wholesaling process. Instead, we're going to make that process more efficient. So those are really the four main ways we can go about this. That'll be the gap information. How do we actually get there? What is the problem? That sort of thing. And then lastly, how do we know we got there? Well, if we get to our desired outcome, we'll know we got there. But we want to have measures along the way. So if we want to get there by, say, using a less expensive product, so we would actually replace certain parts with a cheaper product, that's how we know we got there. Did we actually successfully do that? So here's some examples of scorekeeping. Again, this is just kind of depending on what your problem is. If your problem is sales volume, you look at things that relate to how much product you actually sold. If your problem is a problem with margins, you would look at the specific margin that you're having a problem with. If your problem is not having enough customers, you have certainly some metrics that you want to look at regarding the amount of customers you have. Pretty self-explanatory. So again, basically just kind of recap here. For the solution, you determine what's causing it. So if you have a problem, figure out why does this problem exist? And then you would say, how can we solve it? And then you would say, based on those, what should we do? You evaluate each of the different possibilities to go about solving this. So certainly that's information there. So yeah, we can do lots of things to change our organization using information. So I'm not going to go through all of these, but certainly, the whole concept is that we obtain information and we want to use it to fulfill our organization's desires and goals. So we think back to things like strategic alignment. We want to make sure that whatever we're doing is aligned with our company strategy. So let's say we are Tesla Motors. Do you think Tesla Motors has an organizational strategy that is more in line with cost leadership, or do you think it's more in line with differentiation? I would probably say differentiation there. So if that's the case, we wouldn't necessarily be so focused on reducing our costs. That could be something we would do, but in most cases it'd be, how do we make a better product? How do we make a better experience for the customer? That's the sorts of things we want to keep in mind. So of course the managerial role is going to play a very large part. And it's important to remember that a manager has many different tasks they do throughout the day. This is, of course, a generalization. There are certainly some highly specific managers that only do one thing throughout the day. But we just want to keep things nice and general here. And these are really going to be the drivers of organizational change. If you get your middle management buy-in, you're going to have, in most cases, you're going to have pretty successful organizational change. If you don't receive their buy-in, they're not going to force it on anyone below them. So therefore, it's not going to be successful. Imagine, just as an example, if not a single instructor at Mississippi State made a mask policy. So would people wear masks? Some people would. Would everyone wear masks? They would not. So they had to receive buy-in from each individual instructor. If I had a mask optional policy, I don't. But if I did, some people would probably choose not to wear a mask. Now, that's kind of a hot topic, so I'm not going to go too far into that. But certainly keep that in mind. It's very important to have the buy-in from that middle management group. So let's go ahead and just kind of briefly go over this. Identify some products that incorporate information as a differentiating feature. Let's take a stab at this. Anyone at all? What do you think?
Can you define differentiating feature?
So differentiating feature would be something that helps the product stand out. It's like if you had two products and they're at the store, it would be what makes you more inclined to buy one product over the other. So it's like something that is kind of unique about that product. What do you think?
I would say maybe some tech products that have different specs.
Okay.
Like headphones and surround sound and the box or something.
So the different specification of things like audio fidelity will be a differentiating feature to make it stand out. What do you think?
Sometimes it's gradually. So if I bought something before from a different, I buy pie to clean my clothes, and I just buy pie to use the drawing sheets.
Okay. So, having that knowledge of, what works well for you versus what maybe hasn't worked well for you in the past from other products. One more. Has anyone not answered yet?
Cell phone?
Okay. Go into a little more detail about that.
Cell phones have different processing chips and storage capacity.
Yeah, so certainly, different technological specifications can certainly be used to differentiate products. So those are some great options there. Now, if you ever get a managerial role, one of the most important things is that you communicate effectively. This can be a lot of different ways. This can be face-to-face communication. You want to ensure it's very clear in what you're defining, that you use whatever sorts of tools you have available to you. If email is what you have available, use email to communicate. If you have formal reporting, use that formal report to communicate. You have lots of different options. So make sure you make use of them, and that you also make an effort to use things that people like to communicate with. So for example, imagine if no one liked face-to-face communication. Would you as a manager want to then say, all right, if you want to talk to me, come to my office, or don't talk to me at all? Would that be a good thing to do? That would not be a very good thing to do. Keep that in mind. But beyond that, it's very important from a managerial perspective that you're not overwhelming people with information that doesn't apply to them. So for example, if you had some piece of information that had no relevance to what anyone is doing, that's not going to be very useful. People are not likely to use that. So keep things relevant, and then also understand that there's going to be lots of change as we go. So if you're a company, certainly things are changing in terms of the product landscape. Your competition is changing. There's lots of change all around. Now, when we talk about different types of information, there's this idea that the demand is not constant. In other words, people like to have information that's maybe less verifiable versus information that's highly verifiable. So in other words, certainly things like rumors. If we're a company, what are some common rumors we could have? What about things like who's going to be hired? Are there going to be any sort of employment changes coming down the pipe? Are there going to be any sort of process changes down the pipe? That's information that has a low hardness, but is very interesting. Certainly things like gossip. I'm not going to ask a question, but I imagine some people like to gossip. I'm not saying I'm guilty of that, but I certainly think that a lot of people are. And that's going to be information that's very low in hardness. So the whole concept is we want to have information that has low reliability. It's interesting. Hard numbers about something, that's not so interesting. Why is it interesting if Apple is about to reach a $2 trillion market cap? Well, I think it is pretty interesting, but a lot of people say that doesn't apply to them. Now, if you're invested in the S&P 500, it does apply to you very much. But certainly, that's information that is going to be less interesting than maybe a celebrity breaking up with another celebrity. I'm not saying that's true for me, but for a lot of people, that is going to be very high demanded information. Does that make sense? So that's kind of the whole concept. Now, this also is going to vary by what your role is in an organization. If you're some sort of a mid-level manager, middle management type role, you can be very concerned with meeting those short-term objectives. Whereas if you're a senior executive, you focus on the long-term orientation of the firm. You focus on things like strategy, whereas an operational manager is going to be a lot more focused on things like operational or tactical levels of the organization. Straightforward thing to think about there. Of course, as I talked about earlier in the lecture, there's a lot of different information that's going to be thrown at us, and we have to make sense of it. So one of the kind of drawbacks of that is that we can fall victim to what's called information satisficing. Not to be confused with information satisfying. So when we satisfice things, we're taking the first solution and we're just going with it. That can be pretty dangerous. So someone give me an example of a situation where you wouldn't want to do information satisficing. Anyone who hasn't answered yet? Jarek, have you answered yet? Can you think of anything that would be a little problematic if we just went with the first solution? Okay, so let's say you're driving down the road, and you're looking, you just look once. Is that enough? You're at a stop sign. Could be a case where it's not enough. So certainly that can be problematic. So in information satisficing, you accept the first satisfactory decision. So if we're driving, we look once, we don't see anything, we gun it, we go. That can be a problem. That can certainly lead to some collisions. We want to avoid that if we're driving. So you want to make sure you're collecting enough information. So cars, of course, have blind spots. And this is not a driver's ed class or anything. I'm not going to ask you about where your blind spots are. But certainly know that they happen. And certainly, if we're doing that, we only look once. We're only collecting a limited frame of information. We don't have enough to form well-reasoned opinion on whether we should go or whether we should wait just a little bit. So here's some different ways to deliver information systems. Now, some of you are probably looking at this chart and saying, well, golly, you said last class to make sure that the text is readable. And you're absolutely correct. This is not a great example of a chart for a presentation. But certainly, there's some key points on here. Things like if you're wanting to have people, people have meetings. People have discussions, conversations. They have different applications they're interacting with. If you have files, put that inside of some sort of information system. Maybe something that's going to be shared across an organization. We can certainly do that. Or something that's going to be only usable to one particular employee. So there's lots of different options on here. I'm not really going to ask you to memorize any of these, but certainly understand some different ways to store various types of information. So if we have a graphic that we want to store, how can we do that? Well, there's a couple different ways. First, we could print it. We could store it physically. We could also, maintain it using some sort of a design system, some sort of system that's going to allow us to easily search for elements of that picture. For example, a lot of software now does things like facial recognition. So I believe Google does this. I believe Apple has an implementation of this as well. Amazon, certainly lots of large players, allow you to easily search through your photos and see who is within the photo. So if you have a friend, you want to find pictures of them very rapidly, that's the way you could go about it. So then, of course, we have different sorts of drivers of these information systems. Things that really help us in using them, things that help us in implementing them, getting buy-in from them, lots of different options here. So the first being ubiquity. That is to say, something that is standardized. So ubiquitous meaning that it's everywhere. You think about the number 2 pencil. That's often used as an example of ubiquity. Why is it used as an example of ubiquity? Was it hard to find a number 2 pencil? Not very. It's certainly easier to find that than, say, a number 7 pencil, a number 9 pencil, a number 20 pencil. I don't even know if those pencils exist. But if they did, they're less ubiquitous than a number 2. That I can tell you right now. Then, of course, we also look at things like the uniqueness of information. So, in other words, is the information able to give us very sort of precise measures? So this uses the example of things like a GPS. In other words, would a GPS be useful if it could not provide us with a location up to, say, 9 meters? What if it could only give us a location up to 9 kilometers? Is that useful? You're driving down the road and it's not sure if you're in Starkville or West Point. That wouldn't be very usable. That'd be quite a big problem, actually. So then we also want to make sure the information is consistent. That's unision. So, of course, having that, just want to make sure that if we have information, it's not going to vary across the different places which the information is accessed. Then lastly, of course, we have universal. Universality, I think is how you say that. Not the best on pronunciation, but that's okay. So certainly, this is just saying that this is something that's going to be, in a lot of ways, ubiquitous, but it's going to be able to allow us to communicate in such a way using things that are going to be very common and that are going to be well accepted. So any questions about these? So they're pretty related to each other. They're not identical, but they are certainly related to each other. Okay, here's the last topic we're going to cover today. The idea of fragmented organizational memory. So when something is fragmented, that means it is split apart into different sorts of sections or something like that. So if we think about a hard drive being fragmented, what does that mean? Yeah, exactly. So we have some stuff stored on one sector, but then other parts of that file are on a completely different sector, and the hard drive has to spin around, has to do a revolution to get to that certain point. So that, of course, slows it down. Now, we don't have that problem on a solid state storage, but certainly on a spinning hard drive, that's a problem. Well, organizational memory has a similar problem, where we have different pieces of information stored in different places. So we have files and images. Those are stored in different places. Now, you could also put an image in a file, and then they're stored in the same place. But that's certainly not something we're going to focus on too much. Then, of course, we also have documents and people. So all of these different things are going to be kind of separated out. They're going to be in their own individual places. And then we have some sort of integration software, ideally, that's going to put them all together and allow us to easily access the information. A lot of times it's going to be some sort of internal website. But there's lots of options we can have for this. And then ultimately, this goes to the decision maker. Now, when we think about this, ideally, it's not all within different places. It's all inside the same place. We think of organizational memory as a non-fragmented component, and that will allow us to simplify our processes for managing information, managing our data, and managing knowledge. Unfortunately, this is not realistic. Can you build a system that can store, let's say, non-explicit knowledge? Can it store tacit knowledge in the same system that stores our financial performance? I'm not aware of how you would do that. So certainly, we don't consider things like cognitive knowledge. What are we actually wanting to know? Sorts of advanced skills. How do we do things that we need to do? Certainly, sorts of training tuition. Why things are the way they are. That's certainly important. And then lastly, self-motivated creativity. So if we have creativity, it means we're kind of thinking beyond what we would traditionally think. We're finding unique solutions to problems that we may face. That's going to be focused on caring why. But think about how we actually treat these as an organization. These are having creativity, very important to the organization. It allows us to face unique situations and have solutions to those situations that are not going to be constrained by traditional forces. So for example, let's say that we have a problem with the organization where we can't physically be present to do business. How we go about that? Well, one common way would be to work from home. But what if we could find another option? What if we could find a way to skirt around the problem that we've had and not have any loss of productivity? That'd be a creative solution. The problem is that the amount of money that we spend on training for each of these things is kind of inverted to how much value they actually provide in an organization. So something like cognitive skills, knowing what things are, that's important, but it's less important than maybe advanced skills and system understanding. Yet we spend the most training expenditures on these sorts of explicit knowledge areas that could be solved by having different systems in place to kind of aid in that process. Just kind of review, explicit knowledge, of course, is going to be knowledge that is very sort of hard and it's very kind of numbers-based. Maybe it's based on facts. Whereas tacit knowledge is going to be more about what you've sort of observed over time, sort of your overall sorts of opinions. It's a lot harder to transfer that knowledge. Kind of wrap things up here. If we talked last class about, or 2 classes ago rather, about data. Now we've talked about information. We process that data at some level, and we also talked about how we apply that to problems through knowledge. So any questions about today? All right, that's all I have. I hope you all have a great day.